Have you told your friends that you see ghosts?
Oh, absolutely not.
Gina Rodriguez returns in Not Dead Yet.
I'm back, baby.
Who is that?
Oh, she's the obituary writer.
And Brad Garrett joins the brilliant ensemble cast.
Titan, Maverick, Titan of all Mavericks. These are all words used to describe me.
Not Dead Yet. Season premiere. Tonight, 8:30, 7:30 Central on ABC. And stream on Hulu.
It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. Welcome to another Happy Families podcast. Today on the podcast, I'm excited to talk to Dr. Jo Prendergast. Jo is a parent, a psychiatrist, and a stand-up comedian based in Christchurch. I was going to say based in heaven, Jo, but we'll go with Christchurch. It's close enough, though, isn't it?
Justin, looking out my window at the moment, looking at Littleton Harbour, looking like a pond with all the boats reflecting in it. In heaven is pretty close. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not quite Queenstown, though, so that's why it can't be heaven, right?
Yeah, but it's much quieter and more beautiful, I think, yeah.
Jo, you've written a brand new book. It's called When Life Sucks. It's been published by HarperCollins, and this is a book for parents who are raising teens that are having just the challenges, the struggles, the difficulties. But it's actually not a horrible, hard book, even though you're a psychiatrist talking about difficult things. I guess being a stand-up comic helps there. When you sat down and decided to write a book about when life sucks, what did you intentionally leave out?
Probably about another 100,000 words that I would have liked to put in the book. So the book was very much a case of pruning and sifting out gold nuggets. So I essentially translated all of my psychiatry knowledge, all of the practical things that I do and various subspecialty experts do to support young people who are struggling, and then tried to put all of those gold nuggets through a filter of easy to read conversational language with a bit of humour at times when it was appropriate, so that it was accessible to the average parent.
Jo, when you wrote the book, you described three R's of great parenting. I think this might be one of the most beautiful encapsulations of something that every parenting expert tries to teach all the time. Can you describe those three R's?
Yeah, so essentially the three R's are regulate, relate, and reason. So this came from Bruce Perry, who is a renowned American psychiatrist who was probably the big inspiration for my career, listening to him talk about childhood trauma and the effects on brains and the importance of early intervention. So he's an incredible person.
He wrote a book with Oprah. I mean, this guy's a big deal.
Yeah, he's a big deal. And he came to Sydney and I was a first-year registrar and I went, wow, this is mind-blowing. This is so important. So he was probably my biggest inspiration to work in the area of early intervention and with young people.
So let's talk about these three things. Okay, so if I'm raising, you don't even have to be dealing with a teenager here. Regulate, relate, and reason. This essentially sounds to me like we're dealing with a situation where kids are feeling dysregulated. They're upset, they're crying, they're angry, they're moody, they're withdrawn.
Yeah.
And we're trying to talk to them and it's not going anywhere. So regulate, relate, and reason sounds like a simple process to get things back on track.
I think the first step, even before thinking about regulating the large stroppy child who's just said that you've ruined their lives and you're the worst parent in the world. But the first step is to regulate yourself as a parent. Because if you are dysregulated, emotional, all wound up, that's going to be very difficult to regulate your young person. If you go back to when kids were babies, a dysregulated baby is one that's kind of crying its lungs out, and so we'd pick it up and we'd soothe it and hold it and contain it and jiggle it around. We did things to regulate and stop the crying. And so essentially we need to do that first with ourselves and then second with the stroppy teenager or other young person that's in front of us.
So I want to talk about the stroppy teenager, but we need to talk about this first. when I talk to parents about this one, this seems to come up all the time, the ability to parent yourself before you parent your child. What's your go-to? And obviously every situation is different, but I'm thinking about the parent who is overworked, overwhelmed, maybe doing it on their own. They've been at work all day. They've come home. Their house is a mess. There's ironing and folding to do. There's a dinner to cook. There's a child who's refusing to contribute and participate because they've had a crappy day as well. And now this parent's supposed to, I don't know, take 3 deep breaths and regulate themselves so that they can talk to their kid. How do we, as parents, regulate ourselves so that we can be that adult in the room for our kids?
Yeah, and I think that depends a lot on the individual as well. You know, if you're a parent who's had a pretty benign sort of upbringing yourself and are not struggling with mental health issues, so you're the average sort of stressed parent who's doesn't have a whole lot that they're dealing with themselves, then often just walking out of the room, literally taking some deep belly breaths to get your nervous system back into the parasympathetic nervous system to kind of, I call it the team chill toolkit in terms of the different things we can do to get more of that chilled out parasympathetic nervous system into our bodies is really important. And even though it seems like a cliche of take a deep breath, there's a lot of science behind doing that slow belly breathing in terms of actually changing our nervous system, because there does seem to be a real connection between people. If one person's wound up, stressed, all in their sympathetic fight and flight mechanism, and they're in a room with someone else, it becomes contagious. We start kind of picking up that tension. So the real challenge as parents is to get ourselves into a calmish enough state so that we can then regulate our young people. Because if you think of the crying baby, if you're really overwhelmed as a parent, quite often handing that baby to sort of grandma or a friend who's very calm and relaxed, the baby settles really quickly because they pick up that calm, regulated sense from another adult. And so we're trying to do the soothing the crying baby with a dysregulated teenager who's standing in front of us. So it is a bigger challenge because it is harder to regulate a teenager, and particularly one who's struggling with their mental health.
Yeah, emotions are so contagious as well, aren't they? Like we really do.
Yeah.
We catch whatever vibe is in the air when our teenager storms in, or when they skulk in, or when they try to avoid us entirely. We kind of catch that, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the real challenges of parenting is understanding yourself enough to know what things really press your buttons. You know, I know for me, being invalidated or blamed really presses my buttons. It's very hard if a teenager goes, "You've ruined my life by emailing that teacher about da-di-da-di-da." You know, then it really presses your buttons of that is unjust and unfair, and I did something to try and help. And so you get wound up, they get wound up, and the whole thing escalates. And if parents have had their own trauma history, have had difficulties in the, you know, I talk in the book about ghosts in the nursery in terms of our own experience of being parented that we bring with us at a very nervous system level. And often, you know, we might find ourselves slamming doors or kind of stomping around the house or saying something mean or going into ignoring your kids, or, you know, there's various things that happen that are often reenacting some of the experiences that we had developmentally. And I think that's where parents really understanding themselves, knowing what happens when I'm stressed, how do the ghosts in the nursery affect my own behaviour when buttons are pressed, is a really important part. So that regulate the parent before you even try to regulate the kid is like a whole book in itself, really. That, you know, that's, and the reality is, you know, anxious kids often have anxious parents. Kids who are neurodivergent often have neurodivergent parents. Kids who are traumatized often have traumatized parents. You know, so that makes that regulation even harder if your kid, you know, for example, in my family where there's quite a lot of neurodiversity, one of my big struggles is being on time. And so having neurodivergent neurodivergent kids who also struggle being on time, it creates a huge amount of stress because it's like, I'm trying to do my thing better, but you kids are making it even harder. And I know this is the thing that you really struggle with. And so, this is tough. So I think parents really knowing themselves, what they bring to parenting. I use an analogy about parents being the foundation of the house, and that knowing what you do when the going gets tough is really important. Do your foundations get ultra rigid where you have lots of consequences that haven't been discussed, or do you get all soft and wobbly and there's no kind of direction and the kids just fend for themselves when you're stressed? So thinking of parents being the foundations and the kids being the walls of the house that need to kind of be supported by the foundations.
Jo, when does life suck for teens?
A lot. I think the reality is that for most teens, there's a lot of really big emotions to deal with. And so a relationship breakup is way more intense. There's much bigger feelings, and those feelings are not very well connected with the frontal lobe where decisions and choices are made. So there's often risk-taking behavior or, things that add fuel to the fire. So that's just sort of, there's change, loss, rejection, being bullied. There's so many things that happen just in a standard teenager's life. And, increasingly with tweens and teens, they're dealing with big things as well. And then if you add another layer in terms of struggling with anxiety or depression or starting to develop eating problems or having learning problems or neurodivergence that make it all a lot harder, you've got another layer on that. And then you add COVID isolation and missing out on developmental milestones. And, there's sort of layer upon layer. And then, is our world going to catch fire in a few years? What's my future? There's a lot going on for young people developmentally, and then just adding on top of that mental health struggles and living in the current world. So when life sucks is a lot, and life sucks quite a lot for a lot of parents as well. So it's that combination.
I wouldn't go back and be a teenager today for anything. I have so much compassion for kids being raised in 2023.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're sort of similar era of being teenagers. Back then it was just, will my parents let me go to the school dance? Does my crush like me? Very small, is the surf going to be good today? The issues just seemed so much more manageable back as a teenager in the 80s and 90s, that there just seemed, and that's what the statistics are telling us as well, and especially after COVID, 1 in 3 teenagers is suffering from very high levels of distress, and pretty much all of the mental health issues have shot up, and in Victoria and New South Wales in particular, they're not really coming down either, which is very concerning.
Yeah, Jo, so I'm a parent, I'm listening to this conversation, and I just want one thing that I can do, because it feels like if I was to ask my teenager, they would say, yeah, actually life does suck right now. If I am that parent and I want to do just one thing this afternoon that's going to make a difference, or this morning, or whenever we're listening, what would that one thing be? You've written an entire book about it. There's so much in the book, and I've actually been through every single page of the book. There is a lot of information about so many of the challenges that our teenagers are facing. But what would be your number one thing?
I think probably the number one thing is you need to regulate yourself. No matter what your teenager is going through, if you can find ways to be in an okay place yourself, then every interaction you have with your teenager is likely to go better. And it was Bruce Perry again, my go-to guru, talks about that a connected interaction with a caregiver is worth an hour of therapy. It's a really, really powerful thing. So if you can find ways of being calm and connected and present and noticing your kid, that in itself is likely to make any situation better.
I wish we could talk all day about it, Jo. Dr. Jo Prendergast is the author of When Life Sucks, Parenting Your Teen Through Tough Times, a parent, a psychiatrist, and a helpful person to have in your pocket when you or your kids are having a rough time. Jo, it's been such a delight to be able to chat with you on the Happy Families podcast. Thank you for joining me today.
That's no problems at all.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rowan from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. If you'd like more info about how to make your family happier, visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.